Hey guys, welcome back to the part of the Noetic podcast where we talk about the intersection of music and philosophy. It's less scripted, it's more conversational, and I typically let CJ call all the shots.
Well, not all of them, but a couple of them, at least.
So CJ, what's gnawing at you, man?
Gnawing at me? Well, I'm interested in obscurity, and it's not really so much related to music, but I think it is, at least to the arts in general, this idea that sometimes we choose obscurity in the sense of, so I can think of writers like Kafka who, granted, they have published works, but at the same time I think he asked his literary agent to destroy all of his other works, his diaries, everything. And the most of his corpus, at least, is stuff that he wanted burned. So in that sense, and then also sense that we don't choose it, or in the sense that we get famous, or some band gets popular and then they become obscure again. Or in the sense they got on a Super Bowl commercial and then we'll never hear from them again. So I'm just curious about that idea of obscurity, and maybe if we can delve into it further, or whether it tells us something about why we make music, or do we make music? I mean, does notoriety or fame really? I mean, is that really why we make music, or is it okay to be, or is obscurity maybe just part of it, and we're just we make music or we make art for different means? And it sounds completely obvious, oh yeah, of course we make art because we should, or because of this and that. But I feel like the idea of fame and notoriety come into play. But yeah, I guess just about obscurity, more or less.
All right, so I don't really have an answer, but
it's not an answer. Yeah. There's not a yes or no question, I guess.
But what I can sense is that there are several senses of the word obscurity and obscure at play in the way that you talk about this particular subject matter. Mm-hmm. So there is sort of intentional obscurity, right? Mm-hmm. Which it sounds like an individual like Kafka was striving for, right? Because he wanted to have a great deal of his corpus sort of obliterated, and we didn't want us to have exposure to it. Now, I don't know if that holds for other works like The Castle and Metamorphosis and all.
Some of them were published and others weren't. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm not familiar enough with his authorship to know whether or not he intended to be an obscure writer his entire life, or only a certain aspect of his writing to be obscure. But there was certainly an aspect of his writing that he intended for very few, if not no one,
right,
to have to encounter it. And then there's a sort of obscurity that's unintentional, where you have individuals who are seeking fame very much through their writing, through their music, through their films, or something like that, and yet remain obscure their entire lives. Maybe they have a blip of success. Maybe it happens when they're young, and maybe they're too young to even appreciate the success that they have. They're like a one-hit wonder or something like that, and then they're obscure for the rest of their lives. Or maybe they're like a philosopher like Kant, who is obscure most of his adult life, and then at the very end he becomes this great metaphysician that the whole world is orienting themselves around. Mm-hmm. So I guess which sense of obscurity do you want to delve into first? Because they're very different.
Yeah, I'm curious about the first one, and I think you brought up something interesting too, where sometimes people choose it in the sense of only having a limited audience. So I would like to delve into that, because I think that's something that's very, very against the zeitgeist of today, in the sense where we're all trying to be entrepreneurial and we're all trying to get out there and this is me, show my work and show everything. It's kind of I share, therefore I am sort of culture that we live in, and that to just choose to not be known or to have any blip on the radar, I think is kind of confrontational to that. So that's why I'm curious. It
is a strange posture. I have encountered it before, because I typically see individuals who I see individuals who inhabit one of two spheres. They either are obscure. They're pushing, and remain obscure. They're like, I sharing everything, blah blah blah. This is me. Love me, love me, love me. Somebody love me, and yet they remain obscure. And a lot of the times, if you're sharing and still obscure, and you're putting it all out there, and you're just really not resonating, there's good chance you're not very good. Or like it's not,
sure,
maybe
maybe
you're ahead of the time. Maybe you're ahead of your time. I don't know. And then there are people who are obscure who profess that they want to have notoriety, but never really have the follow through to see their vision through. And I know so many people who fall into that category. It seems interesting. The people with less talent are very much about throwing everything out there and remain obscure. And then there are a lot of geniuses that, for whatever reason, are self-defeating and sort of remain obscure. But then there's this third rail of people who only want to be known in a very limited circle. They're very good at what they do, and they work very hard at it. They're not self-defeating, but they're very content to be, if, say, only like a handful of people or their family or friends know that they exist. And it's always been a sort of a mystifying thing, because when I encounter these individuals, I'm just like, oh my God, everyone should know about you. Like, you're the most amazing person, guitarist or this or that. Like, let me take you and let me put you on Star Search and have America say that you're amazing.
Yeah.
And they'll be like, no, I don't think so. I prefer to remain relatively unknown. And it's beguiled me, because I am such a narcissist and of that sort of love me, let me put everything out there. And I know that about myself. That it's an irreconcilable sort of psychological viewpoint that I've never really had access to.
Sure. Or not even in your philosophy, because I'm sure there's a lot of philosophers, of course, who are popular now, but were obscure in their time. And I can think of Kierkegaard, who's somebody who wrote in pseudonyms, who didn't care that people knew it was him necessarily writing. Granted, I don't know how much he was known in his little circle, or whether he cared to be a popular writer. See, the intent, the authorial intention of Kierkegaard with the pseudonyms is something that you could write an entire book about. So I'm not going to be claimed like this is what he intended but the pseudonyms weren't so much to insulate Kierkegaard from a larger reading public, because he definitely felt like he had something that he wanted to communicate. Right to say.
But the pseudonyms existed more to get people to sort of trick them into trying on existential perspectives, and then seeing sort of the limitations of that perspective or the ultimate fulfillment of that perspective, depending on the pseudonym that we're talking about. I think he thought that the more Kierkegaard was known, the more that the figure Kierkegaard was known, that got in the way of people experiencing his existential system.
So that's another interesting part there, where obscurity kind of helps in a sense, where maybe you just care about putting your ideas out, and you don't really care that they're your ideas necessarily, but that they are just ideas out in the world. So then to have this kind of pseudonym or just no authorship, just to put it out there, that's something. Yeah.
What's ironic about Kierkegaard's pseudonyms is that everybody knew that. It was Copenhagen in the 19th century, so like everybody knew who was writing under these strange, hilarious pseudonyms, right? Like a pseudonym named A, and a pseudonym named Hilarious Bookbinder, and crap like that. Like, everybody's like, geez, I wonder who's crazy enough in all of Copenhagen to do something as Looney Tunes as that. Geez, I wonder if it was Kierkegaard. So they all connected the dots. They knew it was Kierkegaard. So in a weird way, his attempt at obscurity ultimately perpetuated his fame.
But that idea that obscurity perpetuates, or that you're trying to perpetuate ideas, so you're not really concerned about being known as the person whose idea that is. Where it's like embrace. I don't know, it's like not embracing the credit, but just putting an idea into the world. But you don't really care if you get the credit or not. That's an interesting. That's a very interesting
and that happens. Like, I mean, Kierkegaard's not the only person to use a pseudonym, right? Like, a lot of. I mean, there are a lot of people who have intentionally cloaked themselves to get their ideas out there in the world, and remain not famous in their life. Now, usually it's the result of like political or religious pressures or societal pressures, like a lot of women who are writing under men's names or whatever, so they could be taken. So their work, they cared more about their work having an audience. But this would mean that you think that your ideas are more important than you. And this is very rare where you have a separation between the creator of a work and the idea itself. Now, I understand why Kierkegaard would want to create some separation between himself and the ideas he put out there, because ultimately he's putting out a religious program that's saying that the individual really, really matters, but ultimately the individual is nothing compared to God. So it would be very paradoxical if he was trying to get all the sort of attention there. But like, but other people who may have released things under the fear of persecution or duress or whatever just really think that the secular truth or the literary thing or the music or whatever that they're putting out there is of such a gift to humanity that it just has to live. So they must get some sort of sense of satisfaction knowing they've made it. Maybe it's like making like a charitable contribution, but like not telling anyone.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Like just doing a good. I mean, yeah, it's like,
donating anonymously.
Like New Testament. Yeah, like New Testament stuff. You know, where it's just like, does it really matter that you get the credit for doing something good? Like, you just maybe do something good. You know, just because.
I would say like there's something. Maybe they view what they do. I can only speculate because I've always been someone who wanted validation. So this is not me. This would be a new thing for me. Yeah. Is that, I mean, maybe they view what they're doing as a philanthropic gift to humanity, and maybe there's something that contaminates the purity of that gift by stepping out of the shadows and saying, it is I.
Yeah.
It is I who made all of this.
Right. Granted, there is too, I mean, when you say like, I made this, there is a kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but not so much a social pressure, but there's something vulnerable in that sense too, because you know, if you say like, okay, I made this, that it could be, if it is something, yeah, you're being open to criticism and to being lashed out at. So maybe like having a pseudonym is also a way to kind of hide from that basic human, like, I don't like that, that's terrible. You know, that just kind of like, oh, that's disgusting.
Well, so, I mean, it's harder for me to get into the mindset of it. So maybe individuals, whether they use a pseudonym or not, or maybe they only share their work amongst a few people, maybe it's fear of criticism that prevents them from doing that. But
granted, too, even like a smaller community might also be as scathing. So that's the funny part too. Yeah. Is that even smaller groups, you know, like if you think of like think tanks or whatever, you know, like people who just get together and just relay thoughts or whatever, they can be as scathing as
it's easy to get a bad
as well, you know.
Yeah, it's easy. It's almost easier to get a bad reputation in a small town.
Right. So, exactly.
But maybe you can tap into it a little bit. You're a more modest individual than I am.
I don't know. Maybe I am.
You are.
Okay.
You are. You're much more talented, and you're.
Let's not play that game.
Yeah, you're much more talented, and you're less willing to let anybody know about it. So, I mean, can your own experience speak to why some individuals would be willfully obscure?
I always think about just being a good person. I don't know. It's interesting with that kind of stuff because maybe it's a thing too where it's just like, oh, some people are just not good at promotion or something. Where it goes back to the whole idea where maybe being entrepreneurial and out there is sort of the thing, and if you don't do that, maybe you're not good at it. But I really enjoy, at least for me, I really enjoy just putting my roots down someplace, and not really just like, I don't know. I almost use the analogy to a tree, and maybe like sometimes we uproot ourselves like constantly, maybe because we're like, oh, there's better fertilizer right over there, or like, better soil over there, and we just like put ourselves all these different places. Be like, hey, look at me, and just try to put ourselves in different places. But I like just like, at least I'm interested in the idea of just putting my roots somewhere and just letting that grow. And like, maybe it's not the sexiest way of doing it, or maybe it's not just like, oh, I'm just gonna like put myself in all these different places and spread my seeds or whatever.Maybe that's a better analogy, like just like spreading all my stuff, all my seeds, all my art and all this stuff to the world, and hoping something grows. Where maybe it's just like sticking to something and letting it grow, and not really concerning myself with whether other people will get it, I guess, or so just like a smaller group of people. So
you get a sense of
communal, yeah.
You get a sense of satisfaction from seeing the art take on its own momentum without you hyping it. It's like,
in that sense, yeah. I mean, granted, I don't do a lot of like solo music. I mean, I think maybe it's not so much that. Maybe it's more like relationships. I think I'm more interested in relationships than like trying to like have my music stand for something, or have it like, oh, this is my magnum opus or whatever. I think I'm more concerned with people, and maybe that's a reason why some people choose Obscurity, is maybe they care more about the relationships than trying to get their quote unquote art out there, or maybe it's more about the person than their artwork. So maybe that flips that whole conjecture about, oh, maybe the art's more important. Maybe it's more important about the person, and they don't really care about putting their art out in some way. So I feel like it could go either way.
Yeah. I mean, it's like in that way, the art sort of becomes does the art then become sort of an accidental thing that we do? Whereas like your being is actually concentrated in the relationships, and it's like, oh, this just happens to be something that I get some sense of satisfaction from. It's something that was implanted in me. I seem to be okay at it.
Or maybe it's a way to have these relationships, or it's almost what you call like a social object of some sort, where you use it to get relationships. I mean, who was it? I can't remember her name. There's this one woman who wrote this really great book on museums and this idea of interactive museums. So in one chapter she talks about the idea of social objects, or in the sense that some things get people to communicate in a way that just cold calling or just walking up to somebody and trying to talk to them wouldn't. So she uses a dog, for instance. It's Nina. Her name is Nina Simon. I got that. Okay, that's the name, Nina Simon. But she says, like, okay, a dog. Like, you wouldn't just walk up to somebody and talk to them if they had a dog, that's a whole other story. Because then you're talking about the dog. You're like, oh, what kind of dog is it? Oh, blah, 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 blah. And then that you start talking about the dog, and then you start maybe talking about, oh, you're from this place, no way. And then, you start getting personal. I mean, isn't that why everybody, like, every idea for, like, getting out of your singleness is to
have a puppy?
To have a puppy and walk it around, and then girls or guys would be like, oh my god, it's a cute puppy. And then, you use that kind of as a social object. So maybe, like, I don't know, maybe art in some sense, I'm not saying its sole purpose is being a social object, but I think, at least when developing relationships and stuff, it really helps, just something to connect people.
So maybe individuals who are, and I mean nothing derogatory by this or anything like that, but like maybe individuals who are a little bit more self-contained, maybe a little bit more introverted, would use the art as a way to sort of build social networks and to buid community. Right?
Yeah, that's one way. I wouldn't say it's the whole way, but but I think that is one way, definitely, if you think of kind of marginal. I mean, if you think of just like punk rock and all these kind of marginal genres, they are made of people on the fringes of communities that don't feel like they have a voice.
Yeah.
Or that they have any kind of public person representing them, or at least representing their ideals or values. So it's always those marginal, the people on the fringes that, and it's like, oh, that guy gets me, and then they go and join that scene, and then they join such and such a band, and then they start to really be a part of it. Something like that, I think, is definitely true.
Interesting. So I think we had some really good insights. Do you think we've exhausted it, or do you want to go on to the other sense of obscurity?
I don't think we've I don't know if we've exhausted it.
Addressed it perhaps adequately within these parameters.
Yeah.
Or is there more you want to say or ask about it?
No, something's come to mind, though. I don't know which it falls into. There's this literary critic historian named Walter Benjamin, and he talks about the idea of there being two types of storytellers, in a sense. Or one is the trading seaman, or he uses the idea of like of a guy going across the sea and visiting all these different places and gaining all this different knowledge and stories and whatnot. And then there's this idea of the resident tillman, or I can't remember if it was like the resident tiller, like a resident farmer in a sense, who's the guy that stays in one place and gets all of the local lore and quote unquote knows everybody. But I think he was using it more so in the sense of describing stories, how there are some folk stories which are rooted in a certain place in a certain time, and then there are stories that maybe draw from many other different things in a more global sense, as if somebody's traveling. So, I mean, I don't know how that links to what we're talking about, but I felt like it did for some reason, maybe in Obscurity, in the sense that some people like to be a resident, I guess the resident tiller, I think that's what the term was, where it's like, it's okay, it's like just immersing yourself in one place and not really being focused about trying to travel. Or I think, when you think of, I guess, fame or notoriety, you think of, oh, this person is wanted in many places, so that, whether it be touring or public speaking gigs, just the whole idea of moving around constantly. So I don't know where I was going with this, but
well, I'm super curious about.
Yeah.
Is what do you think accounts for if I'm one of these individuals who goes out on the craft and trades, and you're the resident tiller. Our personalities are different.
Right.
And perhaps this is like getting too much into philosophical psychology, and I don't know how much you want to reveal, but what accounts for that difference between us? Is it?
Though the interesting thing, though, I think, to note that Walter Benjamin says at I guess in one part of it, is that he said, I don't know if he says like all the time, but he's like most of the time the seaman settles down and becomes the resident tiller. So it's interesting where it's just like even after all that, like he comes back home. So that's kind of an interesting thing where I don't know if it's just like even after all your fame, like you just want to be obscure again. Or I can think of artists, like a David. I think of like a David Byrne or something like that, where it's just like talking heads, and then just like I want to do my own thing, and then he releases like Brazilian records and crazy ambient stuff with Brian Eno, where it's just like that fame was maybe not too much, but it's just like I think I want to be obscure again. Or I mean, obviously he's not obscure. Well,
that's the thing, is the other willful, that other sort of willful sort of obscurity. So we're assuming that everyone who's willfully obscure is introverted, has never tasted fame, and remains obscure because really they just sort of value people and want to use the art as like a way to build community and relationships. Right. But then there are going to be individuals who go to the absolute zenith of fame, and then once they experience it, they're like, man, this is not what I thought it was going to be. Or like, that was fun for a little while, but this no longer interests me at 40 the same way that it interests me when I was 24. So I think the interesting question is, individuals, I think there are interesting questions about why individuals would want to be world famous. Mm-hmm. And then what happens when they get world famous and they experience that zenith, right? And they're just like, man, you know what? Like, this is not what I thought it would be. And then sort of like why they go back, and do they go back for the same reasons to the obscurity that perhaps the introverted person who wants to avoid criticism but yet wants to build relationships may with their own obscurity. So I think the question is, what drives us to be, and I think Kierkegaard can speak to this, by the way, but what drives us to want to be celebrated and wanted and known?
Well, where does
that come from?
There's a great, I saw a play last weekend. It was called Gideon's Knot, and there's a moment in the story where this woman of a son who committed suicide, and you're kind of like figuring out like, it was just a 2-person play, and you're trying to figure out, why did this son commit suicide, blah blah blah. She reflects this story about how poets and warriors go to the mountain, or I guess the poets are on the mountain, and the warriors go up to the mountain and relay their story to the poets because they want to be remembered. And I think the whole conclusion to that, or at least that what she was saying, is like, people want to be remembered.
Yeah.
So I mean, so to me, I think there's an inherent.
You think it's
point
a fear
where
of
it's
death?
just like, or a fear of obscurity, or like we want to be remembered. I think. And
what's I guess like deeper? Why do we care to be remembered? Do we think? I love this warrior poet anecdote or whatever we want to call it. Does the desire to be remembered come from a desire for some sort of immortality?
You would think it would.
Do you think it, or are they separable?
Okay, the funny thing is that it's like even if some people do get that fame, sometimes like it doesn't last that long. Granted, maybe you would say otherwise, because sometimes, because we have this idea of a canon where we pass on names forever, and if you're in the canon, whether that be literary or philosophical or musical, that you're in it for good. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
but there might be a point where that's not gonna last, and like we're not gonna know who Kierkegaard was.
There are a lot of people.
There's gonna be a point where we're not gonna know who Mozart was. But it's almost like, that's really interesting. Where it's almost an immortality to certain people.
It's interesting. When I go back and I read Kierkegaard, there were people that were definitely famous at the time that he was writing,
and then who we don't know about.
And like that he was like, oh, if only I could be known as well as Swedenborg. Mm-hmm. Who?
Sure, yeah.
Who?
A marginal utopian writer. Yeah.
You know, and
granted, I don't know if Swedenborg is a good example. I mean, I think he's still.
Oh, I know. He was inescapable at a time,
right?
And
now, he's kind of on the margins. Yeah,
he's a very obscure figure now.
Yeah,
but what I'm getting at here is this chasing being remembered, this chasing being immortality. I think, and I see this a lot of people who are interested in sort of like transhumanism and like uploading their consciousness to machines, like as if they're going to live forever if their work somehow are stored in the cloud, or
right. We think we're immortal now just because it's on the web. It's right. Going to be there forever.
Right. So but what's interesting is that technology, in one sense, technology is allowing us to be remembered in a way that we never could have been remembered in the past. Think about like this: the generations that just totally forgotten, had no way to document their existence, and now you and I can upload endlessly if
Do you think it's more ephemeral though, and then because of that, because like we're almost just like everybody's doing it, so then like we're just drowning. So it's not even like like obscurity becomes just drowning in the sea.
The capacity to be remembered, and now that it's so easy to be sort of remembered in this way, we can actually see how futile it is at achieving our ends of immortality. Like you and I mean, we're gonna work this. I'm gonna work this podcast. We're gonna work this podcast. We're gonna work everything really hard, and maybe in our temporal lives we'll experience some sort of notoriety or whatever. It doesn't really matter. And maybe someone will look back on this and they'll be like, "Man, they were really raw, but you could see the goodness of it there." Chances are, not very many people are gonna watch or listen to this. And you know, and even on a larger scale, where you have individuals who have been to the mountaintop and had their moment in the sun, or whatever expression you want to use, but they see how quickly they are supplanted by the next thing because of digital culture. The next thing that supplants you in the news feed, the newest band that supplants your band. Oh, you were really hot like a year and a half ago. What have you done lately? Where's the new record? You don't matter anymore. You don't exist.
Right. Yeah.
So I wonder if there's just everybody is sort of waking up to this false idea that we can preserve ourselves in our work forever, and that there is something drastically upsetting about fame in that way, because you taste it, and maybe that's why individuals like David Byrne or other individuals become more reclusive or obscure in their art, whatever that means, because they are looking for something more substantive after being disappointed by the zenith of fame.
I think that's something you touch on a really interesting point, especially this idea of where now it's almost like I share, therefore I think, therefore I am. It's like now it's like I share, therefore I am, where it's like if you're not putting up content, if you're not doing this, if you're not uploading something every day, blah blah, like you are nothing. You are not remembered. So that, I think that just changes everything, where now it's just like, okay, I just gotta be busy, or I gotta post something, I gotta do this
every day, gotta do it every day.
I gotta do it every day, or I gotta do it every week, like we do, right? Like we post something every week so people know we're still there. Or at least that right? I mean, I don't know if that's what right?
I tell you what, I yearn personally, like now that I'm not working on a lecture series per se, I'll get back to that. But God, I'm such a fucking ham. Like, so now there's like wider gaps between what I share of my intellectual work or my music work or whatever, after making a habit of sharing something every day. So like I'll go like 5 days without like sharing intellectual work, and like I start to get like a little twitchy, and I'm just like, oh my God, have people forgotten about me? Do people still think I'm smart?
Do they think I'm funny? Yeah.
Do they, or have they moved on to the next thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a virtue now, or at least we think of it as like, oh, we're hustling, right? Oh, we're putting out stuff. We're hustling.
Kanye's got another record coming out in the summer.
Sure, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like we're just hustling. We're doing this. We're doing that. But I think what this really touches on is stuff that, philosophy and other things like religion, all these other things touch upon. Is like, okay, like besides all that, like why am I doing this? If I don't get noticed at all, if nobody hears what I have to say, or nobody hears what I have to do, like why am I doing this? And even if like a few people hear it, okay, like what is it? Or few people know of me, like what can I do in service of them to help them and to do this? So I mean, I think
how many counters do we have to have on YouTube here for us to feel like we made a difference?
Right, exactly. Or whether it is something tangible. Well, I mean, and that's another thing interesting too with the internet, where all these things that we think we try to make a difference tangible in the sense of numbers, when it's not not that at all, because it could just be a single person saying like, yeah, I watched your video and I made this change in my life, and thank you for that. But that's one person, and maybe 1 million people watched it, but one person said that. Like, It'd be interesting. It'd be interesting to see.
All
there's
that
a
matters is
right.
the
But
one
maybe,
person.
someone would be like, okay, 1 million people watched it. I'm happy. But if that one, yeah, exactly. It's just that one person that matters. So, I think in this kind of world we live in, where we're constantly sharing, and where that is a virtue, I think maybe obscurity, or at least maybe it's not obscurity, but at least of thinking about that, and I'm thinking like, okay, if I am if nobody knows who I am, like, or if I do not share, what am I? What can I do? I think is the question. Where it's almost like it's like a 21st century existential crisis. I feel like, where it's like, if I'm not sharing, what am I?
Yeah. I think what's interesting is that I've had to multiply the social networks that I'm on in order to build Noetic out or whatever. So I'm like, I don't even know how to use half of them. I'm on Tumblr and Twittering and podcasting, and I just got a Snapchat, and I don't even know what the hell a Snapchat is for. I haven't figured that one out yet. But like, I wonder what the experience. It would be a neat sort of social experiment if like I could just totally divorce myself from it entirely. Like I could just take the computer and throw it out the window and be done. And be done. And like,
I'm sure there's some article where it's just like, oh, I unplugged from the internet, and this is what, like, my story.
But you were always thinking about writing the article, you know?
Yeah, that's true too. You never think of that as well. Yeah, this is my. Yeah, it's almost like Lent, where it's just like, I gave up this. I gave up chocolate for 40 days, and I'm gonna eat chocolate.
Let me tell you
I'm gonna eat chocolate.
I can't eat chocolate because I'm Lenting or fasting.
Yeah,
I can't drink because I'm fasting.
Right, and then you go back and do it anyway. So it's just like, what's the point?
Good for you.
Right, but no, that'd be interesting. Where it's just like, you just give it up, and then you just don't return ever.
I'd like to talk to that person. I know a couple of people I think are like that. I wonder how it affects their psychology.
No, yeah, but I mean,
they're so off the grid, they don't even want to talk to me anymore.
No, really? Yeah, exactly. They don't even have a phone number. No, but I mean, yeah, I guess this is what interested me about obscurity, is that we live in a world where obscurity was kind of a death, or a kind of existential crisis, like I said, and then some people just embrace that or don't care.
Well, there seem to be two ways out. There seem at least
2 ways out of obscurity, or
a feeling like of the existential crisis.
Yeah.
And I think Kierkegaard can speak probably to both, but at least one of them. And I really like this. It's one of, I mean, he has a ton of poetic moments, but it's one of my favorite poetic moments.
I'd love to hear it.
But the first one is, well, like you said, and this is something you generated on your own, is that if you feel, even if this thing gets 22 views on YouTube, and we're like, and you and I account for like 5 of them, like it's pretty depressing. But like you said, if there's one individual who's like, maybe has their thinking altered and their life is made better for watching this, and they say they reach out to us and let us know that, we can take a lot of satisfaction in that.
Yeah. The funny thing though is that we don't account for our lives being changed by doing this too.
And it definitely has,
right? So it's like, we've made a difference to each other. So it's like, it was worth it. But seriously though.
Yeah. Well, I think.
But going back,
I think what Kierkegaard could say. What Kierkegaard could say to this, I forget where it is, and I'll have to look it up. Mm-hmm. But it's like, even. Like he says something to the effect of like, even if you've been totally abandoned by your friends and family, mm-hmm. and totally betrayed by those that you trusted the most, and you're so sick that you can't even speak, God will remember you.
Gosh, wow!
It's like,
yeah,
he's like, so long as you embrace God, you can never be forgotten. Even if you can't even talk on your deathbed, you are remembered. Mm. And that, I don't know. That's
heavy.
That's some pretty heavy, intense, and I think probably is a viewpoint that, that's not going to convince I'm not sure that's going to convince anybody to believe in God. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I don't know. But it definitely speaks to this sense of like, if I don't have the greatest social media presence,
where social media becomes almost like a sort of religion in itself.
Oh, hell yeah, man.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. Like with our different accounts and things like that, and what I'm making here or whatever, I feel like I'm just building like...
Oh, sure. It's like a social pantheism. Yeah.
I feel like I'm just building like a monument to myself. Like I'm building like a hologram epitaph, or some sort of like massive memorial to me, like that, like, you know, my niece's children will be able to point to and be like, we had this crazy family member and I think I'm like him somehow. Look how crazy he was. I don't know, man.
Right. And then it goes to that whole, I mean, that whole Percy Shelley poem.
Ozymandias, is that what it's called?
Yeah, Ozymandias, yeah. I mean, Ozymandias, I think. But, I mean, and of course, the context of that poem, I think, is more political than anything. But at least what I take out of it is
I don't know, yeah. I think it's pretty existential.
Right, is that there's this, that these guys go to visit this statue. I mean, you know this. I'm just relaying it just for people that maybe don't know it. But they go to the statue, or at least the guy relays a moment to somebody else about, hey, we went to see this statue in Egypt, and that it was just feet, I think, at this monument, you know, that the statue is totally ruined. And then they saw the inscription. It says, you know, like, I am Ozymandias, this is my, you know, kingdom, like, you know, fear me, you know, like, look at all of my kingdom here. I mean, of course, he said it more poetically. I forget that famous line, but yeah, you know, look at my kingdom and weep, you know.
Yeah.
But then that was like 3,000 years ago, right? Like he said, like, oh, look how great I am, and then he's gone, you know. And I think maybe we live in a kind of world where it's just like we get like famous through Twitter or something, you know, like, look at how cool I am, blah blah blah, and then it's just like, oh, like 3,000 years later, you know, like just like the whole Ozymandias sort of thing. Like maybe we'll have like a 27th century like Ozymandias sort of thing happen, where we look back on a Twitter feed and it's just like, you know,
who the hell
look upon my kingdom and weep sort of thing, and then, oh yeah, who was that? Like,
who the hell was Kanye West?
Right, yeah, exactly. So I mean, I think that was kind of what I was. That's how I should have opened it, was with that.
So for individuals who will never, I guess the thing is that it doesn't matter if you're Kanye West or Luke and CJ just letting it fly here, or even less visible than that. You know, the fate is the same for everyone, whether we want it or not. Obscurity will happen to everyone eventually. It's just that some individuals during their life will get a taste of fame, and perhaps wish for obscurity, or there will be individuals who will seek their whole life trying to get famous and will live in obscurity. But ultimately, everyone reaches the same end in a earthly perspective. Everyone will be obscure. The race will die out, or there will be no lasting. There may be a situation where there'll be no lasting memory of humanity, you know, and everybody's reduced to zero, you know. Everybody's fame account is zero. So if that's the case, if you take that really long cosmic perspective, and even the people that we may potentially help so that they live a little bit of better life or whatever, they no longer exist. Well, so now we've made the existential situation even worse, right? Because the person that we help is long dead and gone. So then, what? I think it really comes back to what Kierkegaard said, is that the only way to really be remembered is to be remembered by God, because that's the only thing that's eternal and endures. Everything else will be destroyed. I mean, science says this. The sun will essentially, incinerate the Earth one day. And unless we've encountered some sort of interstellar space travel, there will be no way to erect monuments to ourselves in other parts of the universe. So, I don't know, maybe we'll shoot some pods out into space that like have like a vinyl on it, or like we've already sort of done this, right?
Oh,
So the early
the
space
Voyager,
movies, the Voyager contains like artifacts of humanity just floating out there. And if we're the only sentient, rational beings, it just floats. And if aliens discover it,
yeah, do they even have
like
LPs? Yeah, they have a form that's even beyond CDs or MP3s. Yeah, it's just what would it? Yeah, so that's an interesting thing too, where it's talking about obscurity about persons, but now we're talking about obscurity for a whole race. Which is like, oh well, this is what humans are like. Hey, if people want to know, this is what human music is like. Talking to, I guess, aliens or whatever. But yeah, I don't know if we can tie a bow on this, because it's
I think we kind of did, in the sense that, like, I think Kierkegaard gives us really. Perhaps there are others, but
right. But
I think Kierkegaard gives us a pretty harrowing answer for really the only way out of this existential despair.
Right. And maybe just focusing on something other than erecting monuments, maybe just like being a good person as well. Just kind of like, what philosophy and theology and religion and all these things kind of expound on, literature too, I would even say, or art in general. Expound upon is just like being a good person, or just how to live a good life, where sometimes a good life is fine in itself, even if nobody knows you lived a good life.
Yeah, exactly. So and it seems like the good life, if you don't believe in God, it seems like the good life would be somehow involved in helping individuals,
right?
And if you add on that extra layer of believing in God, it would seem to be that it would be a priority to get to know God, so that He remembers you.
I like that.
Not saying. But other than that, what's the point of fame?
Right, yeah. And sharing all this stuff on Facebook,
I can make a case for the good of what we're doing.
Oh, no,
I think we're probably helping some people. We're helping ourselves.
Well,
it's definitely it's definitely helping me.
No,
I get a lot out of it.
No, this is great. But, yeah, if it leaves more questions, that's fine. But I think we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, that was a good one.
It went farther than I thought.
That's a good one, man. I think that'll be good for people. All right, let's call it done. Bye, guys.